Hello, everybody. I am Azita Talegani, Professor of Persian Language, Literature, and Linguistic in the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to the inspiring monthly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies, visual lecture series on Persian language pedagogy, new trends and innovation, which is jointly organized by the University of Toronto and University of Chicago. I am co-convening this lecture series with my colleague, Professor Mir-Djalali from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago. We are grateful for the support of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies and its director, Professor Mohammad Tawakkoli Targhi, and all sponsoring academic units, University of Toronto Faculty Art and Science, Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilization at the University of Toronto, Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, Division of the Humanities, as well as the Center of Middle Eastern Studies of the University of Chicago, Iran Namak, a quarterly of the Canadian Society of Iranian Studies, and Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute. At the outset, I like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to teach, to learn, to work and prosper on their ancestral homeland. It would be my pleasure to welcome Dr. Nahal Akbari from University of Maryland to the University of Toronto. Dr. Akbari is Clinical Associate Professor and the Director of the Persian Language Program at the University of Maryland, including the Persian flagship. She has a PhD in second language education from the University of Ottawa. She has been leading and contributing to various teacher training workshops and collaborative projects in instructional materials development, assessment, and program evaluation at different institutions of higher education across the United States and overseas. She has published articles and book chapters on Persian pedagogy and discourse analysis. Professor Akbari's research interests include intellectual rhetoric, second language writing, and teacher education. She's currently serving as the president of the American Association of Teachers of Persian, AATP. My friend and colleague, Professor Mir-Djalali, will moderate today's session discussion and question answer on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the language classroom towards critically engaged practices in teaching Persian as an additional language. We will appreciate if you save your question for the end of the lecture. And please join me, welcome Dr. Akbari to the University of Toronto and to our lecture series.
Thank you so much. Salam ba hamegi. Azita Jan, thank you. I appreciate that kind introduction. My thanks go to Dr. Talegani, Dr. Shabani Jadidi, Dr. Tawakkoli, and Dr. Mir-Djalali for organizing this series. And I'm thrilled to be getting a chance to share some ideas and thoughts with you today as part of the lecture series. The title of the presentation suggests that today we want to talk about issues of equity, inclusion, and diversity in the language classroom, and in particular, as they pertain to Persian language, actually. So just as a heads up, I think I'd like to let you know in advance if I do it, which is I'm going to ask a question from the audience after a general introduction. So feel free to just unmute yourselves if you want to share one or two words in response or type in chat. I think that ability is there if you prefer. But I think at some point, just in the next couple of minutes, we'll get to that. Sometimes there's a very awkward silence when you just pose a question and you haven't said anything. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that I'll appreciate if you share some thoughts. Like my colleagues at the University of Toronto and Dr. Talagani, I want to start with a land acknowledgement from the University of Maryland, both as a statement that shows our awareness of the history that has brought us together here and an attempt to break away from the past injustices and harms, but also, as you will note, because it is a gateway to the discussion that I want to have today and the topic that we will talk about today. So some keywords in this land acknowledgement are exactly the types of things that I'm hoping we can engage in a conversation about. We at the University of Maryland acknowledge that we are on the ancestral land of the Piscataway people, who are the ancestral stewards of this sacred land. It is their historical responsibility to advocate for the four-legged, the winged, those that crawl, and those that swim. They remind us that clean air and pristine water are essential to all life. This land acknowledgement is a vocal reminder to each of us, the two-leggeds, to ensure that our physical environment is in better condition than we inherited it for the health and prosperity of future generations. We also acknowledge that throughout our history, our university has not always lived up to the ideals of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today, we reaffirm our commitment to building and celebrating a multicultural community. Please take a moment to consider the legacies of bias, prejudice, violence, and settlement that bring us where we are today. And I want to add to all of us who are here today outside Iran, I think it's an interesting moment to pause and reflect on that. So over the next 30 or 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice in language education, both from a theoretical perspective and also some specific considerations when it comes to teaching Persian. I will start with sharing my screen so that you can see some of the slides that I have put some key ideas on. Okay, so as I said, we'll be talking about this. I think I'll take about 30 minutes, and I would love to hear from you because this is not a research study. It is just an invite to a dialogue and to a conversation that I think we have not had among the researchers and scholars and teachers of Persian as an additional language here in the US and across the world. So I welcome your thoughts, and I would like us to join each other in this conversation. There will be questions, plenty of time for questions at the end and comments from you. I'll try to keep it to 30 minutes so that we will have time for that. So the question that I said at the beginning, I want to ask, do we, those of you who are teaching now or have taught Persian in the past or other languages, do you deliberately think about social justice when you plan your curriculum, when you put together your plan for teaching? Is social justice something that is on your mind? If no, I think it's an honest no. And if yes, my question is, how do you do it? What are some ways that you think about it? And I think everybody can see the comments in the chat. Or as I said, if you have other thoughts to share, so we'll just collectively look at them together. Diversity of students, writing syllabus transparently, inviting students to construct a group agreement. Great points. Excellent. So we do consider these issues in our instruction, and I think that comment from Stephanie is true, which is we're doing it more and more. I think there was a time when maybe it was not the forefront of, our planning when we're thinking about our curriculum, but as we go on and as we engage in these conversations more, we do think about them more. These are familiar terms on our campuses and in our daily lives these days, and creating equitable and inclusive environments for an increasingly diverse population of students is at the core of many institutions of higher education's mission. So I'm sure that you have attended workshops, trainings, and webinars on this topic on your campuses. But actually, when it comes to language instruction, the nature of it is a little different, and the challenges are a little different from when you think about other disciplines and how to go about DEI and social justice in your classes. So the meaningful integration of these principles into teaching, into curriculum design, into selection of instructional materials, assessment, and day-to-day classroom practices, it's something that really takes some deliberate planning. So we will start with some theoretical background and then discuss some of these challenges in the context of Persian classes, specifically with the diverse groups of students. You guys mentioned some of them: gender diversity, heritage and non-heritage students, underrepresented students in our classroom. So we will think through all of these together. And I will actually go as far as arguing that the teaching of Persian today, in fact, is in need of this insight from theoretical perspectives that I will share, such as critical language pedagogy, transformative learning, citizenship education, not only because of our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education, but because this is such an important historical moment in Iran, actually, and in what the country is going through right now. And the inevitable conversations that come up in the news around the world, our students face them. It is, even if we wanted to, we could not avoid them. These have impacts on the lives of us as individuals, members of that community, but also as professional instructors, and on the lives of our heritage students, their families, and their Iranian diaspora communities around the world. So I think with that in mind, my argument today is not only it's desirable to think about critical language pedagogy, but I think it is time to actively and deliberately think about it in our Persian language instruction. Some of the theoretical perspectives that we will talk about today, and for the audience that I see here, many of you are familiar with these, but it's just how they come into the language classroom that we will talk about. So basically, our view on critical pedagogy and critical language pedagogy is what we want to focus on now as the main principle that I want to see how we can build diversity, equity, and inclusion into the classroom with this in mind. So I will start with talking about critical language pedagogy, which is a perspective on teaching second language, additional languages, heritage languages, and other languages with base values in social justice and associated with the theory of education that is, in fact, has its roots in the work of the Brazilian philosopher and educator Paulo Freire and the Canadian-American cultural critic Henry Giroux. So critical pedagogy comes from that solid background, and critical language pedagogy is based specifically on the application of that into language instruction. I have, for each of these, I've only put one source, but there are multiple sources, as I'm sure you know, in any of these theories. But these are just some samples of some of the readings if you're interested. When it comes to language teaching, the work of Alistair Pennycook in critical applied linguistics has been informing language teaching for several decades now. Pennycook argues that the nature of second language education requires us to understand educational practices in their broader social, cultural, and political terms. And he believes that that critical pedagogy is actually needed in our language classrooms. It's not something that we can avoid. So the term critical applied linguistics is defined as the approach to language use and education that seeks to connect the local conditions of language to broader social formation, drawing on connections between the classroom, conversations, textbooks, tests, and issues of gender, class, sexuality, race, ethnicity, culture, identity, politics, discourse, ideology. So you know all the broader issues that we constantly perform in and live in, basically. And although scholars continue to refine what teaching looks like with these perspectives in mind, I think one issue is how do you bring them to the classroom? How do you implement them in the classroom? So one area that has tried to focus on what do we do in the class is transformative language education. And some of these are for first language education, for K through 12 context, but many of them have direct implication for second language and additional language instruction. Also, global citizenship education, which again, more and more, this is more recent, I think in the past, not even decade, I want to say 5 years or so, we have more and more become aware of how the realities of the world that we live in terms of the climate, injustices, democracy around the world, how do these shape us? And then what do we do with them in the language classroom? Are we silent about them? Do we bring them in? If we bring them in, what type of engagement are we going to have with these topics? And of course, the concept of intercultural communicative competence. If we have time, I will spend just a few moments on that a little later. But for now, I want to move on to the next one. So the different issues that we need to think about are diversity, not just, and I think some of you mentioned as we started, it's not just students, although that's at the forefront of it, but it's diversity of teachers too, diversity of curriculum, diversity of instructional materials, and assessment. And one metaphor that I like very much when it comes to this area is actually from Bishop 1990, which you might have heard, mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And what we mean by that, what she means by that is, and she has used it actually in the context of reading and literacy for kids, and that books that kids read are supposed to be doing this for them, but it's very apt for curriculum and language curriculum, I think. And by this, she means kids need to see themselves. The mirror aspect is they need to see themselves in the stories that they read. It should be a window into the worlds that are not part of their lives and unfamiliar or different from them. And the sliding glass door part is they need to be able to walk into those, to just get transported into them, walk back and forth, go inside those worlds, know them inside out, and engage with them in a meaningful way. So the implication of this for us is, I know as language instructors, we always think about language and culture, right? It's not just language, they're together. The word culture has its own, literature, basically, in terms of what it means, how it's used from what perspectives. But basically, language instructors have constantly thought about attitudes, perceptions, practices, and cultural products in their classes and incorporating them. So for many years, I think the way we thought about this was we wanted our students to know the culture. We want them to be familiar with icons of literature and history and architecture and music and other things. So when we wrote learning outcomes, there was a time when familiarity of students with these, getting to know them or being able to talk about them was a learning outcome. I think from these perspectives, if we take the critical perspective into the classroom, it's not just familiarity with, it's not just being able to talk about them, it's critically engaging with them and knowing what voices are there, what voices are silenced, what pictures, the pictures that we see, what stories do they tell, what stories are not told. The representations of students in those selections that we make in class and letting them actively, not even letting them, I shouldn't use that word, it's just having them, having the whole group as stakeholders in this to engage with these together. So I think thinking about this metaphor in defining what our learning outcomes for our classes are might be a an interesting way of trying to incorporate social justice, equity, diversity into what we do. So some researchers have basically challenged the idea of a purely practical and proficiency-based language classroom. And they've called upon educators to take a more critical approach to the curriculum that recognizes the political nature of language study. In fact, the current political climate in the US and across the world is often dominated by questions of immigration, including multiculturalism, globalism that we just talked about. And these are issues that I think when it comes to the language class, one thing we struggle with is, first of all, the developing proficiency of our students, right? At what point are you able to bring these issues in, and how do you discuss them? And if the students are not at a level to be able to discuss these abstract topics, is there room for them in a beginner class, for a novice language learner? Or we have to wait for higher levels when students are able to engage in debates and discussions. So one of the arguments that Kramsh has put forward for interculturally competent speakers asks questions that, again, I think are interesting. Every time we select a material to take to class or focus on a cultural aspect of our curriculum, I think one question is not which words, but whose words, whose discourse, and whose interests are brought to the class with these texts. What do these words make possible, and what do they make impossible? How do the speakers position themselves? How do they frame the events that they talk about? So if we take an authentic material, if it's a TV interview, or if it's another sample of people just interacting, I think thinking about these questions and making them part of the language learning experience and process will give us this chance to think about what past histories, what discourses do they draw on, and how do they position themselves. So approaches to culture from this perspective are dynamic and diverse. They invite critical reflection, and they leave room for students to interact rather than, as I said, become familiar with or demonstrate knowledge of. So some of the ways, and I'm now putting my language teacher hat on when I write the learning outcomes for my course, I think using the language to investigate, to explain, and to reflect on the relationships between the practices, products, and perspectives. So it's just at different performance levels, students can actually do this. I think when we have authentic materials that we use at higher levels, it's easier to think about this. But at the beginner levels, I want to argue that it's absolutely possible and necessary. And it might mean that we have some of these discussions in English, not in Persian. There was a time when that was a no-no. It was a big no in your language class. You always speak in language. You use the class time for interaction in language, but actually there is room for it. And I want to argue that right now, with the possibilities that we have with learning platforms and online discussions outside the class, it is quite possible that you don't take the class time for a lot of English discussion, but some of that happens outside the class. Some of it happens in, students do it on their own time. They share these reflections. And then some of the class time is used for just a gateway, basically, into those conversations. And I will have some specific examples in a moment, actually. So I think now is a good point to think about one example of this. So for example, if, let's say we're in a first year class, in a beginner, in an intermediate, in a novice class, and then we share some pictures with students, right? It is interesting to see what, in addition to just trying to describe those pictures, what biases students have about those, and how do they view these people, right? Just based on their appearance, what assumptions do they make about these individuals? I have one example in mind that actually I want to share with you. And right now I'm thinking of somebody that you may, I think all of you probably know, Khanim Fatemeh Sepehri in Iran, and how, just basically the face of the movement that she has become. When you look at her picture, you see, if you look at one of her pictures, and I'm not sharing it here, I'm sure you either know or you can check if you're curious, if you don't know her, by just looking at her in her chador siyah and kind of quote unquote traditional looking appearance of a Iranian lady, you can make assumptions about what perspectives she might have or what views she might bring into, any political conversation or social conversation. And then the moment she talks, all of those images and all of those perceptions are shattered, basically. So thinking about that and thinking about some of the assumptions that our students can bring to class is, and I'm trying to use this as a culturally relevant example and also a socially informed and critically engaged discussion, basically. And there's many other examples that we can think about. So asking about those assumptions, for example, at the beginner level. At the intermediate level, we can ask our students to create a poster or a flyer for an advocacy group, for example, for human rights, for animal rights, let's say, or human rights, or an animal shelter, or something that is environmentally informed, right? So with this, they'll have to go and do research. They'll have to go and bring some of those things to the class. They'll have to talk about them. But within their limited language proficiency, they can actually create something that is just an advertisement or a poster or something like that. So this is something that is, and I think in the chat, Pune or somebody else had written it, I think one key element of these critical approaches to pedagogy is students are actively involved in the process of selecting and decision-making and thinking through these things with you within the local community of the classroom. So all of these are decisions that are jointly made. Even some of these outcomes for the class can be made together with the students. So now thinking about the students, paying attention to how students' identities are shaped in and by their existing language and how these identities are fostered, or denied through the language learning experience that they have in our classes. And here I want to think about, I think this is something that we have all faced it, we have all thought about it, the affordances of Persian language in terms of the gender, and I'm in company of linguist colleagues, so I'll be careful about my words in terms of the gender neutral or genderless categories, in terms of the pronouns, for example. So rather than the she, he, they challenge in Persian, you have u, and that, that's not an issue in some languages, including Persian. Plurals, for example, we don't have gendered plural forms, unlike Arabic. And also some vocabulary items related to jobs. So rather than postman or policeman, we, have atash nishan, postchi. So some of these, our language has affordances and potentials that we can use, but I think we should talk about them. So again, in a first year class, when you have a, list of jobs that you introduce to students, it's interesting to tell them that, by the way, did you notice that these are not gendered in Persian, for example? So that's one way to bring it in. But then there are issues and challenges too, and this is something that I want us to think about. So many of us, I think, and in other contexts too, people now identify whether they want to be referred to as she, he, or they, for example, or other gender titles. Fine if you, in class, for example, it's a third person, you can say ishun if somebody has identified as they, and it's a formal context. So that works. But what if you address that person? ما جناب آقای و سرکار خانم داریم, right? So if you want to be formal, you use these titles. How do you address a person who has said, identify me as they? And I think in English, probably you guys are familiar. This was something that I learned. I did not know, by the way. So rather than Ms. or Mrs. or Mr., what is the title for somebody who identifies as they? If you address them, what do you use? Anyone? Okay, so this is new. It looks like for the audience here, it's new. the title that you use is mix, just like MIX, mix, but it's MX, and the pronunciation is mix, which means you do not identify that person as a Ms. or a Mr. And this is, again, these are new things that are coming into the language. In English, it's new. In other languages, this is something that the societies are generating, and corpus development is happening, and this language is created. However, our problem, I think, for Persian is that because of ideologically motivated silences of language policymakers and institutions like Farhangistan, I don't think it is their priority now to create this type of language, right? To create this type of corpus. So what do we do? How do we deal with this as teachers of Persian here outside Iran and in the diaspora? Or representation, actually, of LGBT, and I have the whole title here. This has, again, this, at some point it was LGBT, now it's LGBTIQA+, which again talks about the transformative times that we're in and the differences that we are daily living, actually. But this representation is not there in our textbooks. I don't think the textbooks I've seen from inside Iran, and I actually want to argue even from here, do not have this type of representation of Jami'eh Rangin Kamani in our instructional materials. So if we say our students ought to see themselves in what's happening in the classroom, we need to act. We need to make sure that even if our textbook does not have it, from time to time, deliberately and intentionally, we design things that actually represent these different communities in the class. So that is one thing to kind of think about and consider. Some other areas that I'll mention very briefly are political and ideological diversity, ethno-racial diversity, religious diversity, linguistic diversity. And on linguistic, as you know, the question is, which accents do we bring into the Persian language classrooms? Is it what do we want our students to be exposed to? One heart says, oh, formal, standard, Persian, that actually we are considering as the prestigious dialect, and we want our students to be exposed to that mostly. But from time to time, we might take other accents or samples from, Tajiki or Dari to the classroom. But how deliberate are we in thinking about how do we do this? Is it just taking it to class from time to time, or is it having conversations around the relationship among these accents, these dialects, language and power issues, ethnicity issues, minoritized groups issues in the country? And each moment that we have one of these in the class is a perfect moment to have a conversation about these from a critically informed perspective. So the word I want to emphasize here is intentionality in bringing non-dominant voices into the classroom from all these different angles and deliberately designing them for different learning outcomes. So this is something that we can think about. I think it takes some thinking, it takes some extra work, but not a lot, because many of these materials are there. It's just a different way of looking at them. It's a different perspective on how we incorporate them into what we do in class. I will wrap up with sharing one example with you. And I want to be careful because I don't want to identify anyone. And I think I had a little earlier one of my students in the audience, actually. I saw that someone was here from current students. So I'll just say that right when the Women Life Freedom movement started, shortly after that in the fall semester, I had one student who was a mixed heritage student of Iranian, and then one of the Iran, I think it was Lebanese, if I'm not mistaken, or some other of the Arabic-speaking countries. So this mixed heritage student, interestingly, it turned out as we talked about things, as we brought issues to class, that in terms of the views, they had affiliations with or identified with the current system in Iran. And, there was a narrative that this student believed in, which was different from the narrative that myself and many of the students in my class were, identifying with, the samples, the pictures, the stories that we every day saw. And one thing that was extremely surprising for them was when the soccer game happened between Iran and the US, and the pictures of the celebrations of people on the streets. And the reaction of this student was, I cannot believe this. This is insane. How is this happening? Now, I want you to think, and I thought about this very carefully. How do you respond to this as a teacher in class? It's one thing to have my personal and emotional response to this. It's another to be in that professional environment and making the class a safe space for this student as well. They have every right to feel like the classroom is a place where they can express this view, not being silenced, not being afraid of the reaction of others. So that was a moment when all of us actually decided that we will define and create some rules of engagement for our community, for our class. We will decide what are some of the rules of a respectful and, productive conversation around these issues in class. If we want to disagree, and this was an advanced class, so we could do that. We used it as a teachable moment to talk about how do you respectfully disagree with someone? How do you express your opinion? What are some of the words that you can use, that you can say to the person? I don't agree with you. I see it this way. So that was an interesting moment, but also that student decided that they wanted to follow up on those conversations. So we had many office hour meetings. After class, they would come to me, sit down, we chat about things. And it was not an attempt on my part to change their mind, but it was a genuine inquiry and asking questions to learn about the other perspective. And I can't tell you how much I learned from that experience myself of being able to create that room and listen to each other. I think that's something that we need. And I think when it comes to sensitive topics, it's not easy, but it's absolutely needed. And whether we want it or not, we need to be prepared for it. So I think one last point that I will mention and wrap up with is that I'm trying to put it on the slideshow right now because it's the last slide, so I should be able to do it. And this one I want to read out actually. So the point is, we do not want to be colorblind, gender blind, or accent blind in the classroom. Instead, we want teachers who are well equipped with the methods and approaches to incorporate all these complex dimensions of diversity into and their political and historical context into the language classroom in a meaningful and empowering way. This needs to be done with buy-in, trust, and input from the language learners and members of minoritized groups themselves in our classes. So that is, I think I will stop there. And there's one last thing I want to show you, which is a resource actually from ACTFL. You may already be familiar with this. Let me just try to bring this one up. And then as I'm doing that, we can get ready for questions and answers. I'll just skip this one. Here we go. This is Words and Actions, Teaching Language Through the Lens of Social Justice. This is very practical because it's an ACTFL publication. I think if you've already used it, I would love to hear from you and see if it was useful. If not, I think it's a good example from some other language classes and how they incorporate these issues into their classrooms at different levels. And with that, I will stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nahal John, for this very, very important and interesting and novel discussion that you brought to the floor. I would like to just very quickly go over the various points that Nahal mentioned. I hope that I can do it justice, but I'm not too sure. But just bear with me. I'm just going to mention the main topics so that it will refresh your memories to ask questions. So Nahal talked about topics of inclusion and diversity in teaching Persian language. Of course, she very rightfully started with land acknowledgement as an apt opening to her talk. She talked about social justice in our language classroom. She gave us, I think, 6 different theoretical perspectives to this, including diversity in class. Like critical pedagogy, critical language pedagogy, critical applied linguistics that she invited us all to refer to because it's more relevant to us, transformative language education, that is what we do in class, and global citizenship education, which she told us is quite recent, within the past 10 years, and intercultural communicative competence. Then she talked about diversity from different perspectives, from the perspectives of the students, teachers, curriculum, instructional materials, and assessment, each of which she gave a nice background about. She also talked about critically engaging with the students, that is of paramount importance in our classrooms. She talked about new trends being toward less traditional, less proficiency-based teaching methodologies, and she talked about misconceptions and assumptions and how to bring it to class and invite students to give us their opinions. She talked about engaging students in the selection of material. She mentioned gender identity and gender diversity, the fact that beautiful Persian language doesn't have any gender, it's genderless. She talked about U and Ishan. So, and also inclusion of Jamee Rangin Kamani, LGBTQIA+. And she talked about political and ideological diversity, ethno-racial diversity, religious diversity, and linguistic diversity. And she ended her discussion by talking about rules of engagement that she does in her own class, that is building respectful like situation rules for the students in order to express their opinions. Which it reminded me of actually a very good technique that sometimes I use in my advanced courses, and it has answered very well, is debate. Like you said, how politely to, to agree or to disagree with other people. It can be taught through debates very beautifully, and I completely agree with you. I have a lot of questions, but this time I would like to start with the audience, and then if we have time, I will ask mine. So please raise your hands in order to ask your questions. Okay, maybe I can ask a question since nobody is raising their hands. Maybe it will give you some time to think about your questions. So I just wanted to ask you about ACTFL. I know that you mentioned that publication 2018 of ACTFL, but I mean, the basic tenets of ACTFL somehow go against bringing in inclusion, like bringing in diversity into classroom from the novice and even intermediate, even advanced levels, because in ACTFL, we know that we can, the students, the learners are only able to use the language for, let's say, for abstract thinking when they get to the superior level. And before that, we are not going to expect them to, engage in kind of arguments or giving opinions. That is not part of what ACTFL guidelines is. So I just wanted to know how you navigate through sticking to guidelines of ACTFL, but still including diversity in your classrooms.
Thanks, Poonajan. I think, so the way I personally go about these is ACTFL is just one resource out of many, many others that we look at. So I've always been, and even, everybody who work together, colleagues, students know that I keep, even when it comes to proficiency levels, I don't look at ACTFL alone. It's the Canadian benchmarks as well. It's the Australian benchmarks. It's the European framework. And a combination of all of those together make up how I try to make sure. And again, when we talk about empowering our students, they're also aware of this, right? This is something that students are familiar with. They know about these expectations of proficiency at different levels, but absolutely going beyond it. I think whenever we see something is restricting us or it does not answer our questions, there's no need to restrict ourselves to it. I think they're just, and when you have a one paragraph description of something, it can't be liberating. It can't be allowing you to do the types of things that you want to do. So just using it as one resource, but, you know, just going wild with it and taking it wherever you want. I don't necessarily see any reason to strictly stay with those guidelines.
Thank you so much, Nahal Jan.
Yeah.
For the audience here, we are hopefully going to have a discussion in Mesa with Azita and with a number of other colleagues who work on Arabic and Turkish and Persian about these guidelines, of different kinds of guidelines and the use of them in our language classes. Azita has her hand up. Azita Jan, you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much, Punjajan. Thank you, Nahal. I think that honestly, I learned a lot. I am teaching 22 years Persian, and the way that you highlighted this important issue that nowadays we see more in our classroom. I remember 10 years ago, 15 years ago that I was teaching. Perhaps it was there, but we couldn't notice. Perhaps the students really, because the society didn't let us to go in that way, and to look at carefully about these important important things that we have in our classes. And you highlighted very well, it's not just teachers, students. I am worrying about the teaching materials, instructional materials that we have. And at the end, assessment. You know, and these are very important that perhaps someday all people who are teaching Persian language, this is my ideal situation. We get together and talk about instructional materials and the way that we go for assessment. Yes, I agree with you, ACTFL, you know, the Canadian version of that Canadian benchmark, and the other that we have in Europe, they are just standard, and we all know that practically it's not that much, they are helpful, but what we are doing in the class is totally different with what we see in the standard that they have in their books. My question is that when you highlighted about instructional materials, about Persian, I am wondering how other languages instructional material, because I have this opportunity to be the coordinator of different languages in the last 14 years. I have to check with my colleagues how much this information about genderless stuff or the information that we have for minority social group that we have recently included in French classes, Italian classes, Spanish classes, because this is something that is not just Persian or Arabic. This is something that I think that we have to do it, all people who are in the pedagogy. We have to look at it in very critical way, and it's not started by just English teaching or French. We have to get from each other. We have to learn from each other. I'm curious if you have seen recently, for example, French speaker or Arabic speaker, they change their textbook regarding this stuff or not. If they're not, it means that this is not just Persian. Perhaps it is specifically European languages, because European languages, they are those who write the French, Italian, German textbook. They are applied. They are a team that always revise and edit the new material. I didn't have this chance. Definitely, I asked from my colleagues, but I'm wondering, have you seen this? How the European languages textbook change based on the social justice, equity, and diversity?
Thanks, Azita Jan. You're absolutely right. I think, again, this is recent. This is something that textbooks, just by their nature and how long it takes to produce textbooks, are usually not, catching up with the speed that we want, with the transformations and changes that are happening in the society. So they're trying. I think, at least from what I know, some of the Portuguese materials, some of the colleagues who are working in Brazil, for example, on instructional materials, deliberately try to, and they publish on it. I'll probably find a few references I'll be happy to share with you, or workshops and webinars that they have on how they're going about it. Just the other day, some of our Spanish colleagues on campus had something about decolonialization, which does not necessarily apply to the Persian context, but it's a very important issue in, across the world in many contexts of teaching either English or additional languages. So I think one answer is there's no need to restrict ourselves again to textbooks, although I know that especially at the beginner levels, it is important to have a textbook, but teachers always create supplemental materials. They always take their own resources to class. It's just how they engage with them, right? And I hope I got the message across that you don't even need to create new materials. It's just your selection, being deliberate about the things that you add to those textbooks and take to class, and the types of questions that you make around them. I think it can just be one picture that you put on a slideshow, and then a whole conversation can happen around, that picture and the silencing and the voices and comparisons that students can make, and personal histories that they can bring into engaging with those. So yes, you're right. It's across the board. It's not just a Persian issue. I think I'll emphasize that. And I think I said that at some point. With some other languages, there are communications and connections and working together inside the country and outside around the world. It's been challenging for us to work with colleagues inside Iran. They do excellent work, and sometimes it doesn't get published in a way that is accessible for everybody, and we can use even guidelines for proficiency, for example. I know they've done a ton of work on that recently. But then there are silences over there. There are ideological, there are limits to how far they can go on issues like this. So unless we, as you said, join forces here, and not only within the Persian community, but with other languages, unless we do that and participate in these discussions. I'm happy that Pune mentioned that the session you have at Mesa includes other languages as well. I think that's the way to go about it, right? So hopefully these are some of the ways that we address these challenges. Assessment, which you mentioned, is absolutely important. And I think for that too, we need to think about another issue that has come to fore is neurodiversity in the students. We have students who are not able to, or are not ready to engage with the traditional tests that were made. And how do you go about assessment to make sure that diversity is reflected in it?
Oh, thank you, Nahal. Thank you.
Any other question from the audience? Yes, Stephanie.
I have some smaller maybe questions, 3 of them. Okay. So one is, I was just curious how you engage. You mentioned that you might engage your first year students in English to discuss these issues, perhaps outside of class, which I think is a really smart use of time. But I was just curious if you could expand a little bit on how you do that, whether if it's like a discussion board type of thing, or if it's just between you and the student. Also, is there a Persian equivalent to mix? No, I would like to know. And third is to you and to anyone with this experience of incorporating other accents, like Persian accents, into especially listening activities, film, or whatever else, specifically like Dari. If there are, for example, I have a friend who is a student here at West Point, where I teach, who is Afghan American, but so she as a student took Persian here, but the instructor at the time made her feel like the accent that she was learning growing up was, less than Iranian accent, right? So I'm aware of this and trying to, keep this in mind, but we're teaching a pronunciation, right? So if anyone has experience with that, I would be really interested to know how you deal with that.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. I'll answer your two first questions, and then the third one, I hope colleagues from the group will have some thoughts on it. How do you do it in class? You're right. Most of it happens outside the class, and we use ELMS. So for the discussion board on ELMS, actually, I think that's a good place to have some of the discussions happen outside. And sometimes students record voices. They don't even sit down and type because that's more comfortable for them. And that's this way, there's a lot more, conversation that is in depth that happens between them. But I'll be very honest with you. I think I'll use some of the class time. I take the liberty of taking, 5 minutes out of a 50-minute first year class to talk about these issues, especially when I have a student in class who identifies as they, them. And then when we're doing an activity and we say, "Aghaye Felani," or people hear it, they hear it in the audio file that we have listened to, and they ask and they say, "Oh, what do we do?" So that is the time when we have to talk to this student and say, "Listen, we have this restriction right now." And then in that class, actually, we tried. I don't know if it worked well. I wish we had other resources. I'll have to think about this creatively. But we said, let's create our own term inside the class. Like if we don't want to say آقای یا خانومه, بجاش چی میگیم? What do we use instead? And the students can have input. That student, I think this is the key to me. That student should not feel left out. They should feel like, oh, this is, and we shouldn't feel awkward and weird about it. That's the thing. Sometimes it's so difficult to deal with this because they say, I don't know what to say. I don't know if I'm saying the appropriate thing or not. How do I respond? And we're all learning this. That's the thing. We're all in this together.